Kia ora and welcome to this week's episode of The Niche Cast. We are from The Niche Case, theniche-case.com, home of major Aotearoa sporting yarns. On our website, live right now, got a Kiwi-NRL spotlight on Hayze Perham, Bulldogs fullback. Done a Warriors versus Cowboys preview. Got the weekly Flying Kiwis up live. Nico the Wildcard's done a Wellington Phoenix update, as well as a Stephen Adams update, even though he's done nothing, which I found interesting that you could whip out a bunch of words about a bloke who's done nothing. So that was impressive. That is to be said, there's a lot of Aotearoa sporting information found on our website, theniche-case.com. As a warm-up kōrero here, I was in my regular processing of sporting information. I heard a basketball fan outline how they are quite calm in support of their team, and this is a team that's been in a lot of hostile situations, and I resonated with that idea because I was rolling through the teams that I'm following closely, and I'm feeling pretty calm about these teams. We've just had the Breakers in the finals. I'm feeling pretty calm about where the Breakers are at, and I don't think either of us would have said that, in previous Breakers years. But I'm calm about where the Breakers are at. I'm calm with where the Blackcaps are at. I'm just calm with what the Blackcaps are doing. I'm calm with the Warriors. Holy guacamole, I feel calm with the Warriors. I just said holy guacamole for the Warriors. I don't know what to say for the White Ferns other than I'm feeling calm for the White Ferns, and that is equally as surprising as being calm about the Warriors and calm about the Breakers. I'm feeling calm with where the White Ferns are at. I'm not necessarily saying they are a super duper team, and this breaks into the definition of feeling calm about a team. I know what the White Ferns are, I know what they are capable of, and I'm feeling calm with that. As I rolled through those teams in my mind, and I thought about how to throw this up to you, you cover a lot of football, and I just thought you're probably not feeling calm about the All Whites or the football Ferns, and they feel like the least calm teams in our immediate scope. Our major sports, our headline acts at the Niche Case, they feel like the least calm teams. Is that an accurate assessment of your psychology?
Yes. Yeah, I don't think either of those teams are particularly calming. I don't think those teams are particularly deserving of allowing people to feel calm. They're not really letting that happen. Funnily enough, though, I think I might be calmer about them than, well, certainly the football Ferns. I think I'm calmer about the football Ferns than a lot of other people, which is a weird one to say because they're not a team to be calm about, as I just outlined. They're not. There's 5 months before a World Cup. They've got several key players injured. They haven't scored a goal for 5 games. They've been losing a lot. Those are not calming. Those are not calming outcomes. But I'm also seeing a lot of panic reactions from people who are suggesting solutions to problems that don't exist, which is really crazy because that makes everything so much let's drop all our experienced players and pick a bunch of youngsters who are unproven and have never played at this level. And we're completely overlooking the fact that there's a big jump from A-League to international football. But yeah, sure, let's do that. That'll make everything better kind of thing, which is not true. I would argue actually it's a lack of experience that's kind of half the problem, is because they've got a lot. They do have a lot of young players pushing through already, but the young players. It's not like the young players what you see in the Blackcaps, where it's like the guys who come through were the young players pushing through. Then they were in this sort of holding period for 3 or 4 or 5 years with their sort of establishing their international credentials, just gathering reps and playing here and there when the opportunity arises so that they're ready when someone else retires or steps away or is injured or whatever, ready to step up. Football Ferns have kind of, and I think this is a decade-long problem at least, kind of ignored that middle tier. They've got young players coming in to replace experienced players who have retired, and a third of their World Cup squad from 2019 has retired. So that's one of them other myth-busting things. And there's not that middle tier who are ready to go. There's young players having to learn their stuff on the international scene at a time where we're desperate for results that we've never achieved before. So it's not calming, but at least I think the fact that I've written a lot of words about it and thought about it and like kind of outlined some of the stuff and the reasons for it makes me a little more accepting of the fate than others have been. And I actually think because a lot of their results have been influenced by players being injured and not available, I kind of think they're going to do better at the World Cup than people are giving them credit for. I'm not just saying they'll get that win they're desperate for. I think I still think they probably will because I think they can beat the Philippines. Getting out of the group is really tough. I'm starting to think that's probably asking a bit too much, but I certainly don't think they're going to embarrass themselves at the World Cup like some people think. All whites are a little different because it's the start of a new World Cup cycle. So we sort of had that, I think maybe a little bit too calm about the All Whites. In fact, you know what? I think I'm probably less calm about the All Whites than the average person and more calm about the football ferns. Like the All Whites haven't scored for 5 games. They're also doing the same thing where it's young players pushing through, a bit different because those young players are the best players they have. So it's kind of they deserve to be picked. Just it takes some time to get used to international football, especially when all your best warm-up results were against like Gambia and Curacao and stuff, to step up to then play like Peru, Costa Rica, Australia, teams like that. So we'll see how they go against China next week. I think they're all right. But I do think they're not, well, they're not yet where they're going to be, of course, but also I think the least calming aspect of the All Whites has actually nothing to do with their squad. It's the fact they don't have a coach, and we don't know who's going to be hired as coach. The guy they wanted turned around and just like ghosted them for a little bit, and then didn't want the job. Don't necessarily have the faith that New Zealand football are going to hire a particularly good coach. Like that might also be an issue, as they just latch the team with someone who's not quite up to it. So not particularly calm there, not particularly calm about the football ferns, but in some key ways, I think maybe calmer than a lot of other people in a funny way.
I'm reminded of a line in a paragraph that I deleted for the Blackcaps win over Sri Lanka debrief.
Bonus tracks.
Yeah, the cutting room floor. And I referenced Outcast, and I was like talking about Kane Williamson. I was like, he did his best Outcast impersonation, where he says, "In the middle, we stay calm, we just drop bombs." I was like, that was Kane Williamson. And right now, I'm feeling just Kane Williamson in the middle, dropping bombs, calm AF, ready to go to win the game for my nation. Big up, Aotearoa. Tomorrow's a Friday, so we're dropping the email newsletter via Substack, thenichecase.substack.com. Lots of important Aotearoa sporting information will be part of that newsletter. I've got a bunch of junior Kiwi-NRL bits and bobs that I'll be unleashing, as well as any Blackcaps information, because I'll probably write about Plunkett Shield tomorrow, and then there'll be some background Blackcaps information in that email newsletter on Friday. Those are sent out every Monday and Friday evening. Sign up at thenichecase.substack.com. And big up to all the Patreon whānau. Patreon is the best way to support the Niche Case and all our content, the podcast, the website yarns, the email newsletter. The best way to support all of that is via Patreon. Patreon.com/our Niche Case. We've got Kiwi-NRL spotlights coming every Monday for the Patreon whānau, as well as our Blackcaps podcast, usually happening on a Tuesday as well at the moment. So big up Patreon. There's lots of extra content for the Patreon whānau. Otherwise, it's just a great opportunity for you to support our mahi directly. And we always start with a dose of mindfulness. Vamos.
Yeah, here we go. I got a line from the poet William Stafford, which is real good. But then I was looking it up, and there was also another one that I also wanted to read, which I thought was real good. So I've kind of got two here. The first one is just a preview mindfulness, which is him talking about being a poet, where he says, "Everyone is born a poet, a person discovering the way words sound and work, caring and delighting in words. I just kept on doing what everyone starts out doing. The real question is, why did other people stop?" Which I thought was a great line. But the actual mindfulness I had was, once you decide to do right, life is easy. There are no distractions.
That one hit my soul. Can you repeat the second one?
He's that kind of poet, I think, as well. one of those dudes who aims for the soul specifically. Once you decide to do right, life is easy. There are no distractions.
Just let that simmer. Great audio. Just let it simmer in your loins. As soon as you get into that purity of your soul and life, there's no distractions. You're just living, and you're living in flow, in the zone. Let's kick off the Aotearoa sports with the Breakers. The Breakers lost to Sydney Kings in the NBL Finals. Overall, it doesn't feel that down buzz. Like, I think that we've documented the resurgence of the Breakers, how they have improved, and how they, and funnily enough, the Phoenix, and funnily enough, I think the Warriors are doing the same thing, have all responded post-pandemic really nicely, reconnecting with their local communities and with Aotearoa. So I think for the Breakers, on the back of that loss in Game 5 of the NBL Finals, it feels like they are in their rightful place. That's how it feels to me. And again, like, that's why it feels like I'm feeling calm about the Breakers. There's no need to stress or anything like that about the Breakers. They are in their rightful place. How do you feel about the Breakers and their loss in that finals series against Sydney?
Yeah, I didn't think they would get as close as they did. I sort of felt like for the first half of the season, I just didn't believe it because it's like we've seen glimpses of the Breakers being really good in the past a couple of years, but only ever glimpses. They never sustained it. They didn't have the, I would say, they didn't have the head coaching. Certainly not that they have now. They didn't have the players that they have now. They didn't have the team culture or the throw. What was that? What was the thing that I said about what's that mindfulness quote? What do you say when you have the right when you decide to do right, life is easy, there are no distractions. It sort of felt like the Breakers for 4 years under the current ownership were full of distractions, right? Like, distractions everywhere. And it's funny how much the sort of, I mean, I don't expect people to be holding grudges or anything like that. I mean, we've moved past that ourselves, and so I don't expect fans to also be like holding them accountable necessarily for like the Glenn Rice dramas, or that I think it was that second year in charge when everything, or like the way they handled Kevin Braswell leaving, and all this, like so many self-inflicted wounds and just bad organizational stuff. But and yeah, leading to distractions, and they were their own punishments because the team sucked around that time. They were terrible. Like these things directly led to them being bad basketball teams. So it goes. I think in a funny way, like people, because I don't hear that version of it mentioned that often. People just sort of leave it as the simple thing about like, oh, they had a tough time during the pandemic. Like, yeah, so did lots of teams, and maybe not as much as the Breakers, but the Breakers made things worse for themselves. In a funny way, I almost wonder if like the pandemic stuff was almost the best thing that could have happened to them, because I think that was surely an impetus for them reverting back to what the club has done best in the past and really embrace. It's probably, I would imagine, why a thing to do with why Dan Shamir left. Just no one was enjoying it, and he wanted to go back and be with his family properly, and then that that opened the path for Mody Maor to come in and be the best head coach in the NBL by a mile. Although the dude with Sydney Kings is pretty handy himself, even though he's a bit more of a whiner, I would say. He's a frustrating dude to watch when he's the coach of the other team. It's just like complaining about stuff. At least you get the feeling Mody will hold his players accountable, even when refs are making mistakes as well. He'll also be like, okay, the call wasn't good, but you need to do this sort of thing, as opposed to just whinging away, mate, honestly. But or walking out of press conferences. That at least was a fun little narrative leading into the final. But I think the way the pandemic stuff, like getting back home, and it almost just set a reset button that the Breakers really needed, to where they now had like clarity of what they wanted to achieve. And a lot of that was just the vision of Mody Maor. But when they had that clarity, when they decided to do right, so to speak, it's crazy how easy it was for them to get back to this level. And it's not simple. Just because it looks easy or whatever, it doesn't mean it's simple. They had to scout extremely well. They bring in the best imports. They had to implement this very impressive defensive mindset. They like all this stuff. But yeah, so the first half of the season, I didn't necessarily know if it was real. And then once I got to the point where it's like, okay, no, this is legit. They're a good team now. They've got a really good coach. Their imports are fantastic. The Kiwi dudes are doing their job. They're the best defensive team in the league. At no point, though, did I feel like they were better than the Sydney Kings, defending champs, also extremely good at everything that they do. So it sort of felt like, well, if they can make the finals, that's a successful season. And then the fact that they managed to force a game 5 is just beyond, above and beyond that. The fact that they lost it in the end, ran out of steam in the fourth quarter, okay, it happens. Like they lost to a better team, though. And you can't ever complain when you lose to a better team. Sometimes you can beat a better team. That's sports. It can happen. But if it doesn't, you gave it your best shot. You took it as far as like much further than anyone expected. Certainly, it's like miles further than anyone thought was even possible at the start of the season before all this. That's not just a successful season. That's above and beyond. Like that's just incredible work, start to finish. Didn't get them the NBL championship, but it's laid a blueprint for Breakers' success for the future, like moving forwards now, which they had gone so far away from for a while there, and it's to be regained in this fashion is I don't know. It's just one of the most incredible sporting stories I can remember covering. It's absolutely nuts how they've just switched things like that and just gone back to like regathered what they used to be so good at when they were winning championships, being that Breakers dynasty in the sort of mid 2010s, you know?
What did you see from that fifth and final game as an example? Like Sydney are better or were better at this. Sydney outplayed the Breakers by doing this. How did you see some of that basketball stuff? Because you said Sydney's a better team. What happened in that final game that you saw that displayed that Sydney were the better team?
Well, I think definitely a few of those like been there, done it before championship credentials stuff were pretty helpful. Because the Breakers started brilliantly. Like they were up, I think, a dozen points early in the second quarter. Their first quarter, they'd kept Sydney to, I think, 11 points. They had a nice big lead from the start. And Sydney just slowly clawed away at it. And I think a team without that championship pedigree is going to struggle to do that, to keep their heads under pressure when you're down double digits in a closeout game, like the decisive game of the season, and you're losing big at home. It's not that easy to know, okay, we can't do it all at once. We just got to steadily like get a stop here, make a bucket there. We're not going to be like leading in the next 3 or 4 minutes. We just got to steadily keep doing our thing. And eventually the Breakers did have spells where they cooled off. And in the fourth quarter in particular, Sydney had the clutch shooting, the Breakers didn't. Like it's almost that simple. They're obviously much deeper strategies and matchups and whatever within that, but ultimately, like the Breakers missed some gimme shots as well as some tough shots, and both teams defended excellently. Like it was a low scoring game. It's kind of probably what we expected from these two teams in a game 5, was that it would be like that. But then, you know, the lower scoring it is, the more important every shot becomes. And Sydney had just a few more of them, and they were able to claw in the Breakers, who themselves had a big scoring drought, I think, midway through the fourth quarter or slightly early fourth quarter. I can't remember how long it was, but it was like a 12-0 run or something like that, which took the Breakers from being slightly ahead to comfortably behind, and Sydney are now in control of the game kind of thing. And I suspect as well, one of the main reasons for that, as well as just them knowing how to own the big moments and having really good players, and, you know, Derek Walton and Xavier Cooks playing their best stuff for the entire series in the fourth quarter of game 5 is a pretty big deal. But I also, like, you had, you know, old mate Angus Glover was just another one of those, like, he didn't have a bad game throughout the series, and he was playing injured in game 5. It was incredible. Like, this is a depth dude for Sydney, popping up with big shots, big plays. The Sydney Kings had depth on their bench where they could just go to dudes and they would come up with massive moments like that. The Breakers, you saw in game 5, Repair barely played. Glidden got about 5 minutes, and didn't really do anything. I think he had one rebound. It was the only contribution to his box score. Um, Rob Lowe was in and out, but there was a bit more because of fouling. But obviously Barry Brown top scored off the bench as well. But you pretty much just had like a 2-man bench unit there. So it was like a 7-man rotation, the 5 starters plus Lowe and Brown getting the majority of the minutes, whereas Sydney could go 8 to 9 deep. And, you know, it's probably not a coincidence the Breakers started missing shots in the fourth quarter when they were probably tired at the end of a very grueling series where throughout the series their rotation had become shorter and shorter and shorter in order to lean upon the most reliable guys. But then you lean upon the most reliable guys and you run out of gas. You're asking more from their star players than the Kings had to ask from their own star players. So there's a little bit of that sort of like depth and aspect as well, which probably came back to get the Breakers in the end. But I mean, they would have had a deeper roster than pretty much any other squad in the NBL. It's just that the Kings are very, very good. That's where we start, where we finish as well with the Breakers final series, is that they did lose to a better team, and there is never any shame in that.
Sri Lanka lost to a better team.
Only just.
Only just.
Only just.
The Blackcaps have the second test against Sri Lanka in Wellington starting on Friday. The most important things here are some of the selections. Like obviously Neil Wagner's out short term. He'll definitely be back long term because he's Neil Wagner. Likely to be replaced by either Doug Bracewell or Scott Kuggeleijn. I think in my test bowling rankings, I had Doug Bracewell ahead of Kuggeleijn because he was kind of, the way they portrayed it was he was the first choice for that Bay Oval test, but he was out injured and he wasn't playing a lot of Plunkett Shield cricket. So then Kuggeleijn comes in for that test against England. So you could go with Kuggeleijn or Doug Bracewell. And that's interesting because, again, like I think the nuances of each pitch are really interesting. We talk a lot about Bay Oval and the conditions there. Talk a lot about Hagley, where Tim Southee averages 21. And that tells you a lot. And Matt Henry's fantastic at Hagley as well. Obviously, that's his home deck for Canterbury. Base and reserve is always thrown up as a bouncier deck. And I could see that working in Kuggeleijn's favour as far as selection goes. Obviously, Doug Bracewell, one of my favourite bowlers ever. Nice outswing, natural rhythm. Just a fantastic cricketer. Kuggeleijn and Bracewell, both decent batters, both good fielders, and they fit the mould of trustworthy players for the Blackcaps leadership to call upon. And this is part of like every time, as you said, every time you go younger, the chances of winning decrease. And the Blackcaps are in a pretty healthy position where their depth is plug and play. They might not be as good as Neil Wagner or the other guy we're not mentioning, but they are plug and play bowlers. Like Doug Bracewell can do a job for a test. Kuggeleijn can do a job for a test. Tickner can do a job. I think he's building into that can do a job role. Like he's still adjusting to test cricket, but he feels like he's going to be one of those bowlers who can cover an injury, cover an unavailability. So that's one area of selection to ponder. The other is Henry Nicholls and Will Young, where it's like they've waited so long to drop Henry Nicholls. I don't know if it's going to happen for this test, but it's also like the thread has been so long that it might be time to bring Will Young in. Will Young dipped out of that first test squad to play in the Plunkett Shield, but he should be available, or it's a tight turnaround. So one would assume he's probably not going to play if they finish up today, and then he goes straight into the test group tomorrow. So that'll be interesting. Which one of those selection pockets is more interesting for yourself?
They're both pretty interesting. Probably the bowling one more so. So just say on the Henry Nicholls stuff, I don't think they drop him when there's one test left in the summer. Like I think you have to go into the series saying we back you for this, it's like we're giving you 4 more innings, maybe. After that, we'll reassess because we have to reassess at the end of summer every year. That's because there's no test matches for a little while. That's kind of when you hit the breaks. But I don't think they'll drop him for this game because I just don't think that shows the patience or the it's. I'm not even sure if it's clarity, but it probably is like just clarity of thinking, but certainly the patience that the Blackcaps have tended to show. It just seems like if you were going to drop him, you either drop him before the Sri Lanka series or you drop him after the Sri Lanka series. You don't drop him halfway through. So I think he gets one more test, one more opportunity to score some runs. I did see that Matt Henry has scored 3 Test 50s since the last time Henry Nicholls passed 50. So, um, but then again, 2 of those were at Hagley, and as you say, Matt Henry turns into prime Richard Hadley when he plays at Hagley. So there you go. He's also another really good example. I don't know if I've said this before, but I keep thinking about it, where it's like this idea that the Blackcaps need to freshen up their test team. Matt Henry was not a first 11 player until the guy we're not mentioning opted out of his Blackcaps centralized contract. You know, he stepped up at that moment when a key player was no longer considered. I won't say available, I'll say no longer being considered for selection, and has been excellent since. And not just with the wickets he's taken, but even just the way he's bowled. It's very, very clear. You saw that in the first innings against Sri Lanka when Southey and Henry were bowling. Blackcaps looked like they could take a wicket at any moment. And Sri Lanka batted very well to limit some of that. And they got through it, and then on came Wagner and Tickner, and the runs started flowing. And yeah, to your point, Tickner probably did enough in that second innings. Like, it's not just that he got 4 wickets; he got 3 very big wickets, and also took out the night watchman early on the last day before the last day, because the last day was the rain affected one. Those are important wickets to get the Blackcaps rolling in that innings, and it is maybe true to say that you can't necessarily expect a bloke to be at his best in his first test or two. Like, it might be one of those things where it takes a little bit of time. I don't love Blair Tickner as a bowler, particularly in this format. I like him a lot more in the shorter formats. Don't love him as a test bowler, but he took 4 wickets in the last innings. You know, you can't just ignore that. Like, that's the kind of production that gets you selected for the next one, particularly when one of the other guys is out injured. And I do agree with what you're saying about Doug Bracewell. The way they framed his being called up was like, we would have had him, we didn't consider him for the England game because of injury, therefore, you know, he wasn't picked, but he is now because he's back available again. Like, it sounds like he will jump the queue ahead of Kugelheim, who I don't love Tickner as a test bowler. I really don't see the point of Kugelheim, though, who's a worse version of the same thing. I don't particularly get that, but also we're talking about, like, I don't know where your depth chart gets up to there by the time old Cougs is in there, but you've got to be 6 or 7 or 8 or something. It's not high on the list. There's got to be 3 or 4 guys out before someone like that. And by the time that opportunity next comes around for someone that low on the list, it might well be Henry Shipley who's overtaken him, or maybe a Ben Lister, or whoever. Like, there's maybe not as much depth at this moment in time as we have had a couple years recently, but it's also being exposed in a way we're not used to, because Wagner's missing at the next test. Jamison's injured. Fellow we're not mentioning is not being picked. Well, there's 3 of your 4 top bowlers. So you obviously have to dip deeper in. And the further you go into your depth, the more that's going to affect the ability of the players you can pick. Like, that's why the guys are the best. Same thing I keep saying about the football ferns. If Ria Percival's not there, whoever replaces her is not going to be as good. It doesn't mean the team can't win, but it just means it's a little bit harder to win. And every time that happens, it's going to be the same, because you can only replace your best players with players who aren't as good, or they wouldn't be your best players in the first place. So I think Nicholls keeps his spot. I think Bracewell comes in for Wagner, and I think that's probably all they do.
Yep.
And as much as we'd probably both like to see, and many other people like to see, a specialist spinner, particularly on a wicket where Jack Leach bowled 61 overs or whatever it was in the most recent innings on it, Michael Bracewell is just going to do the job, and maybe Michael Bracewell is in a position where he's also had better score some runs or take some quick wickets, or else maybe he's in the same position as Henry Nicholls. I don't know. But again, you don't make that change mid-series. You make that change next tour, and we'll see where that is. Because I assume next tour is probably going to be an overseas one, in which case it probably wants a more specialist spinner anyway. So we'll see how that goes. I don't know what I don't. I have no idea what the test thing looks like moving forward, but we'll just focus on winning this next test, eh?
So expect more runs than wickets. Like the only Kiwi bowler who's got a low 20s average at the Basin Reserve. Well, I changed it. Sorry, so I made it more recent. But all the major Blackcaps bowlers average high 20s or early 30s at the Basin Reserve. But then you get into some of the batting averages of these lads at the Basin Reserve. Taine Williamson averages 67. Tom Latham averages 51. Henry Nicholls averages 60. That's going to be interesting. Tommy Blundell averages 70. Daryl Mitchell, he's the worst. The best batter is the worst at the Basin Reserve for the Blackcaps. So as far as balance of runs and wickets goes, you're looking at these batters love Basin Reserve, and it's a bit harder to take wickets for the seamers, and it's always like green seamer, but the Basin Reserve dries out pretty quickly, lots of bounce on offer, and I think that's what the Blackcaps batters like. This is a really important test for the Blackcaps, and we discussed this on the Patreon podcast earlier in the week, because there was a big investigative yarn about how the Blackcaps went from the top of the World Test Championship to the bottom. Basically the opposite of the Breakers. How terrible for the Blackcaps. But if the Blackcaps win this test, the last test in the World Test Championship, they could move up to mid-table. So suddenly it goes from being first to second to last to being first to mid-table, and the Blackcaps would have been unbeaten in their last 4 test matches of the World Test Championship. So a strong finish for the Blackcaps could just change the whole way we reflect on this World Test Championship cycle, because it is quite dramatic when you say the Blackcaps won the World Test Championship and then they finished second to last. It's a bit different if they can win this test match against Sri Lanka and shake up how the Test Championship ladder looks in hindsight at the end. I think that's really, really interesting. And again, Blackcaps haven't lost the series at home. The only consecutive tests they've lost in New Zealand have been in different series, and they always find a way to win a test and bounce back, and they've still got that high competitive juice that we like to see in the Blackcaps test team. And that's evident in the individual performances. Blokes are scoring runs, blokes are taking wickets, and the team is fighting back in really tough positions, as we've seen against England and now Sri Lanka in New Zealand. So hopefully a test win here can just change how this World Test Championship ladder looks.
Yeah, I haven't got it in front of me, but from memory, they would I think they'd jump up to 6th. Is that right? So they'd go from 8th to 6th. They'd overtake 2 teams, one of whom would be Pakistan and the other would be
West Indies.
Sri Lanka or West Indies? Yes, West Indies, I think. So that's something. All that really says is that if they played these series at the start of the thing and won them or whatever, and we're assuming they will win the second, which they might not, because Sri Lanka are fairly decent.
It's an important test. They need to win.
Yeah. We're talking about if they get over the line rather than saying when they. So, I mean, it does make a big difference, and it's just one of those things. If they played these games at the start, the scheduling does make a little bit of the factor when you consider these things of looking at a table midway through. Yeah, but they haven't played this team yet, or if in the case of these ICC things, they don't play this team at all. I think that's the case with Sri Lanka, where you look at they didn't play I don't think they played India or England or South Africa in this particular round of the Test Championship, and they played Australia at home. So they didn't actually have. This is their toughest away trip, basically, which is part of why they're up the top there. And they played well. There's a decent Sri Lankan team, underestimated certainly coming in, but Blackcaps are also excellent at home. And maybe, just maybe, they have dropped off. Like I'm not denying that they're not as good as they were when they won the World Test Championship. Maybe they're not as far off that as people think, though. And when you look at like the reason they've dropped off is because they haven't really had the services of Kyle Jamieson or old Bolty, unmentionable Bolty, or Taylor Watling, like De Gronholm. That's nearly half their team that haven't really played Test cricket since then. And Williamson, we know, struggled with injury for the first half of this Test Championship. So he wasn't playing very much either. Same thing. Like if best players aren't playing, again, you're not going to be quite as good. Like that's just natural. But also this idea that they've lost those players, they can't be replaced. Well, actually, fair play to him, because this is not underestimating BJ Watling, but this is entirely because we know what a beloved and important player he was in the Blackcaps, for fans and for teammates. Tom Blundell, we've lost nothing with Tom Blundell. He's scoring more runs than BJ Watling was scoring, and he's keeping just as well. Like, that's incredible from Tom Blundell, who has stepped up to this. Daryl Mitchell wasn't in the World Test Championship 11 and has scored, I think he's got the best average since then. I'd have to check that. Williamson gets dragged down by the England games, but who was the other? Oh, Matt Henry, I already mentioned earlier. Like, there's three guys right there who weren't first 11 players at the last Test Championship and have almost been the three best players. Maybe you make a case for Southey, maybe you make a case, well, you certainly make a case for Williamson, but they've been three of the four best players probably since over this particular cycle. They're new players in the thing. They're not young players, so people don't look at them like they're rookies fresh on the scene or anything like that. But they are newly minted first 11 players. And that is how the team has refreshed itself. That's how the team used to refresh itself, getting to where they got to winning the World Test Championship. It's how they've continued to refresh themselves since. Maybe the talent isn't quite as high in a couple of areas. We do seem to be like a seam bowler short at the moment. But again, that's because a lot of guys have been injured or unavailable. They haven't dropped off that far. Like, they're still a pretty good team. And I expect I expect them to get good results continuing at home for several more years to come. I don't see any kind of bottoming out process coming along for the Blackcaps. It's still going to be pretty good. And you know what? I'm calm about them, just like you are. I'm calm about them.
One major thing for Kiwi cricket fans to tap in with is Kane Williamson's excellence, because he has already hit 2 centuries this year. And since 2018, he hasn't scored more than 2 centuries. So he's got big years: 2017, 3 centuries, 2015, 5, 2014, 4. That's when you played a lot more Test cricket for the Blackcaps. March of this year, he's already hit the 2-century mark. He's got a lower average than previous years, but that could increase with even more runs as he packs his way through the season. So watch out for Kane Williamson. Best batter ever from Aotearoa. Could be doing even better things. That's pretty cool. The Warriors are taking on the North Queensland Cowboys on Saturday. And it's been an interesting couple of weeks for the Warriors, just because they have played, I don't know what you'd name this, and it's not going to happen every week because you're going to play Queensland teams that don't have teams in the New South Wales competitions, but you do have these like club days maybe, where the Warriors face the Knights and the Roosters in all 3 Warriors grades that they have: NRL, New South Wales Cup, and SG Ball. So they went 2-1 against the Knights. 2 victories in those 3 grades, 1 loss. And then against the Roosters, they had 1 victory last weekend, New South Wales Cup, and they lost SG Ball, they lost in the NRL. And that seems really fair. The Warriors are better than the Knights, not quite as good as the Roosters, and that's pretty solid. So I do want to highlight that, because coming up against a team like the Cowboys. You've got New South Wales Cup are facing North Sydney Bears, and SG Ball are facing Panthers. So it's a bit more scattered, so you don't have those gauges to really measure where the Warriors are at. Now they take on the Cowboys, and we've got a debut for Taine Tuaupiki. And this throws up another deeper trend that I've discussed in today's preview on our website, thenews-case.com, as part of the Aotearoa Warriors Diary. Taine Tuaupiki was recruited from Queensland footy, even though like all these dudes have links to Aotearoa. Taine Tuaupiki lived in the same place as Te Maire Martin, Taharoa, and all these other dudes that I'm talking about, they are hearty like connections to Aotearoa, but they recruited him back to Aotearoa, and now Taine Tuaupiki's making his debut. There's another dude in the SG Ball team. Please forgive me for pronunciation, but doing my best here. Ti Hata Tere Hapa Iarau Reid. He's starting on the wing for the Warriors SG Ball team. And along with someone, Julian Drennan, who I don't think has played much SG Ball. And there is someone else whose name escapes me because he's not on the team list. But they were all playing for Bay of Plenty under 20s on the weekend. And they all joined the Warriors SG Ball squad from footy in Queensland. There's another dude, Harry Durbin. Those three guys I just talked about, I couldn't find any background information about them playing junior footy in New Zealand. But Harry Durbin is a Pikiao junior from Rotorua who went across to Australia, and he was playing for South Logan last year. Now he's in the Warriors SG Ball squad, and he's starting prop most weeks. And then you go into New South Wales Cup team. Basically, everyone in that New South Wales Cup team, apart from the Warriors juniors, was recruited from other NRL systems, or they have experience in other NRL systems. So you do have this trend of Warriors making real nice recruitment moves from players who spent time in Australian systems. For the SG Ball lads, it's a bit more unknown, but we're still learning about that. And I just found that really interesting because at the NRL level, it's most evident in Taine Tuaupiki, who came up through that Southeast Queensland kind of scene and impressed in Queensland Cup last year. And he has helped the Warriors New South Wales Cup team to 2 victories in their 2 games to start the season. He's starting at fullback. Lively up yourself, because Taine Tuaupiki is lively at fullback. Not the same big body as Sean's Nickel Klukstar, but he's quick, he's nimble, he pushes up in support, he's a good passer, and I'm just excited to see him play footy, because he's the type of player who you get him around the ruck, he's going to put a couple of steps in, jerk this way. I didn't want to write this, but it reminds me of how people talk about basketball players because they got a herky-jerky style. And I kind of felt that way about Hayze Perham because I found his line break against the Storm, and it was a bit herky-jerky. Like, the way I wrote it was bouncing, like bouncing sideways. Bounce this way, bounce across the ruck, burst through the line. Whereas I think Perham and Taine Tuaupiki are a bit more herky-jerky. Like, they're just herky-jerky. It's jerking this way, herking that way, bouncing this way. I don't even know what herking is, but the term that comes to mind is herky-jerky, but Taine Tuaupiki's got a real good burst of speed. He's a bit smaller, so he can wiggle between defenders as well. So he makes his debut, and it's an example of I think it's an example of the identity, same with the Breakers, that the Warriors are trying to build there. But it's also an example of really nifty recruitment, because some of those, when I threw up that idea about the quartet of players, Nickel Klukstar, Te Maire Martin, Maratini Okore, and Tohu Harris, you highlighted how 3 of those were new recruits to the Warriors, and now another new recruit who's got hearty Aotearoa connections is making his debut at fullback, and that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing his James Harden step back 3. That sounds good. It's I mean, that's definitely that Perham run that you're talking about, the big line break. Like, it felt like that actually felt like the same thing. I know that's what you're saying. It's like it felt like a little James Harden kind of step back, where he's like he'd get up to the line and he'd not just like step sideways, he'd almost go backwards to go sideways to go forwards, and that was an insane run. That he's played quite well. I was going to ask you about him too, because I was going to ask you to pick out like a, I don't know, like a chuck the spotlight on someone, but of course you already wrote a spotlight article on Hayze Perham at the doggies. But we might want to do some.
Just
Well,
work through
take
the
that if you
Warriors.
want, but we can finish on the Warriors first because there's a little bit more to say on that. I don't know how just in general, because I think there's an interesting parallel. Obviously, all the Kiwi sports sides competing in Australia are interesting parallels to each other, but the fact that the Breakers laid down this blueprint on their own success, and it was largely built on really good recruitment, really good sort of team culture, but almost in a way where it was like a cultural reset as well. To like it became an emphasis that it hadn't been in past years, and I think you can see elements of both of those things. Whether the recruitment is quite on the same like top tier caliber of what the Breakers got in order to turn them into championship contenders, and also where they're in a bigger league like the NRL, bigger and more competitive, more players on the field, more teams in contention. Whether the pathway to glory is quite so, I think it's longer in the NRL. I think it's harder to go from the bottom to the top. Certainly in that short space of time that the Breakers
Warriors
did.
have never been
But
at
there's
the bottom
elements
though.
of both of those. Warriors
Warriors
have
have
never
never
been at the
won the wooden
bottom. That is
spoon.
true.
Yeah.
Never been wooden spooners. But there are elements of what the Breakers did there in the Warriors, and I'd say the other main element for the Breakers, like third option out of three, because I'd count the like Kiwi emphasis on their players. I'd count that as part of the team cultural stuff and also their recruitment. Like it crosses over both those ideas. So recruitment, team culture, and I think the other one is just really, really good head coaching, which sets a tone on both of those other things as well. They all cross over with each other, but that remains to be seen a little bit with the Warriors. But I'll be honest, I like Andrew Webster. I've liked what he's had to say in preseason. I like the way the team is playing so far. How are your feelings on that with just like the stylistic aspect of the Warriors? Because you mentioned last week how we saw a team that was like ripping it, like running hard, making tackles. Um, how you still feeling the same way after a loss to the Roosters in week two?
Yeah, so all the like cultural stuff, like I think that like this is the reason why the multicultural in Aotearoa is so amazing, because there are like spiritual terms and ways to frame all of
Yeah,
this. Like you can just say Turanga Waiwai. Both like Breakers, Warriors, they've established their Turanga Waiwai. They have found their Turanga Waiwai. They are raising their mana and all those things we love about Aotearoa. And I think they all fall into that bucket. And I see those similarities. The coaching, both teams, Breakers and Warriors, and you can say the same for Ufuk Talai. Like
definitely. Yeah, for
the
sure.
players play for the coach. You can see a certain energy and vigor in how the players across all three teams are performing, and that's what I've noticed about the Warriors. But I think the key thing in that comparison to the Breakers is the defense. The Breakers built their whole season on defense, and you heard Modi Moa talking about the defense prior to the season. Like he was saying, the only teams who win the NBL, and this goes for any other league, the only teams who win, the championship teams, are the best defensive teams. And he said that prior to the season. Now we're reflecting on a season which they made the NBL Finals and took it to a game 5. So that was pretty good to see. And that's what you're seeing with the Warriors. Like, some of their stats are pretty impressive. I think the eye test is more impressive to me personally, because you're actually seeing multiple blokes putting shots on, which is just like awesome. Like just run up and smash someone. That's all you need to do for like the fans to be engaged. It's quite simple, but they are doing it. And I mentioned this in the Monday newsletter, reflecting on that performance against the Roosters. I updated it in the Aotearoa Warriors diary. Tohu Harris, Maratini Okori, Mitchell Barnett, Wade Egan, they all made over 40 tackles with at least 94% efficiency. The smallest bloke in the forward pack was the only one to miss 3 tackles. Everyone else just missed 2 tackles against the Roosters. Adam Fanua-Blake and Josh Curran, they both made over 30 tackles at 94% efficiency. You get into some of the team stats. The Warriors are 13th for missed tackles, and we've had 2 teams play a bye round, or chill in a bye round. So you can take it down from 17 teams who have played games this season. Take that to 15 teams who have played 2 games. Only 2 teams have tackled better than the Warriors to start the season. The Warriors have missed 55 tackles in their first 2 games. The Cowboys, who they play this week, have missed one of 4 teams to miss over 70 tackles. So whether it's the vigor that they are tackling with or just pure stats, the least you can say is that they are defending for their coach. Whatever their coach has done in the offseason, the Warriors are responding. And that's probably the best sign of the coaching stuff that you're talking about. Like, he seems like a good coach. In the same way Mody Maor seemed like a good coach, you're kind of seeing the players respond defensively to that. And I'll be really interested to see how that looks against the Cowboys. Obviously, they got Taumalolo through the middle, but they don't have Scott Drinkwater at fullback. They don't have Peta Hiku's distribution at center. And I think that the Warriors could, again, showcase some of their best traits in this game against the Cowboys. And when I think back to some of the errors that you saw against the Roosters, right? Like, there was no dummy half for one of the plays. And all I've heard during the week, classic NRL media Warriors stuff here. All I've heard during the week is how hearty the Roosters were. Roosters down on this troop, down on players. Like, yeah, they were missing a bunch of forwards, right? Like, all of this stuff. As I said, Harris made a bunch of tackles. Mitchell Barnett made a bunch of tackles. I think Harris made over 60 tackles, and he's barely missing tackles. Like, you expect a certain level of heartiness from the Roosters. You don't expect it from the Warriors, but they both showed it. And some of those errors that the Warriors made that stopped them from winning the game, I think they come down to, like, a lot of tackles made in really tough conditions for a Warriors team. And I'm not stressed about lack of clinical attack from the Warriors necessarily. I view those missed opportunities as a product of all the effort they were doing on defense and a bit of fatigue and not being able to make the right decisions at the right time, which isn't ideal. But I'd rather the Warriors kind of take care of some of those defensive bits and bobs, because, Taine Tuaupiki is a pretty good attacking player. There's a bunch of good attacking players in this team, and if they get those opportunities again, this is where you'll see the coaching of Webster on display. You would hope for some improvements in how clinical the Warriors are, especially against the Cowboys. But ultimately, the same thread, the same theme, the same identity that made the Breakers successful, in 2 games, the Warriors have shown drastic improvements in those areas, which is pretty good to see.
And if you don't make those drastic improvements in those areas, you're not in position to be in those, like, a set 10 meters out from the goal line in the last 10 minutes where you're trying to get a try to tie the game up or anything like that. And then maybe the mistake comes in because you're fatigued from all that. But if you didn't do all that in the first place, you're losing by 20 points at that stage, and it's all irrelevant. You have to do that to get into those positions. And as they get more used to that, and also there's it's not just that the Warriors are in the start of a new regime with a few new players and things like that, and there's obviously an integration process, I guess. I don't know what the better word is. It just takes some time to get that up and running, to get everything nicely oiled and whatever. It's also game 2 of the season, and no one's at full match fitness. And of course, there are going to be, like, issues where you're puffing a bit in the last 10 minutes. And you know what? It sounds a lot like what we're saying about the Breakers at the start, where it's like, For them, it's different. It's not because it's the start of the season. It's because they had a shorter rotation in game 5 of a really ruthless series. But they'd been spending the whole game defending like champions, still were defending very good. At no point did Sydney Kings blow past them. There were a few times there when they were on that run where it's like maybe the points are coming a little bit too easy around the rim, but it was because the Kings were playing at such a good pace and moving the ball so well. Like they were getting those layups because they were making 3 or 4 passes leading to the bucket, sort of thing. That's hard to guard, especially dudes who are tired. Some of them are on foul trouble. Like, um, not dissimilar to what you're saying about the Warriors, where it's you put in that effort, you're going to be tired, but that effort is going to also keep you in the contest to that point.
Just a quick word on Hayze Perham, who we did mention before, because he is the one starting fullback things for the Bulldogs, and it's really interesting. I wrote about him during this week, so check that out on our website. That is live right now, including his line break against the Storm with that herky-jerky run. Hayze Perham started the year in that All-Stars game in Rotorua, and he's from Rotorua. So that was like an automatic, like, holy guacamole, this is awesome type of moment. He's at the front of the haka. Like, I can only imagine what that would feel like to be doing that type of haka on your home turf for the Māori All-Stars, first game for the Māori All-Stars, I think. And now he's starting fullback with the Bulldogs. Some of the background around this is really interesting as well, because Hayze Perham spent time in the Panthers system as a teenager. I think he got homesick and came back to Rotorua. That's when the Warriors signed him out of Rotorua Boys High School. But Cameron Ciraldo was working in that Panthers system at the time. Apparently, he knew of Hayze Perham. I'm pretty sure Phil Gould would have been in that Panthers system at the same time as well. And now he's with the Bulldogs, as is Cameron Ciraldo. So you've got that funky background, and that's why they have shown trust and faith in Perham to start at fullback this season. He
might have crossed over at the Warriors as well, would he?
With who?
Like with Perham, would that have been the same when Gould was associated with the Warriors? Would he also have had like time with the Panthers, the Warriors, and now the Bulldogs? He might have done the full three. Might not have quite lined up. I'm not sure.
Yeah, the month where Phil Gould was working with the Warriors.
Yeah, the one. yeah, that month.
Fantastic. That was a waste of time. So Hayze Perham is facing off against the Bulldogs. Quite an interesting bit here is Stafford Toa. Like in the junior ranks, Stafford Toa was a monster fullback. Like, he was one of the best players coming up the grades in Aotearoa before he left to go to the Knights. And he was a fullback out of St. Paul's College. So you've got, and now he's like playing a backup centre role at the Tigers. I think Stafford Toa is an absolutely starting NRL player. But obviously Australian systems disagree. But he is starting for the Tigers at centre. So at least that's good. But I think the way these two teams are shaping up right now, I think this could be an interesting game to keep track of Hayze Perham at fullback. So I think the Bulldogs, they're humming after their win over the Storm. Hayze Perham was decent, but he wasn't like above and beyond fantastic. He is doing his basic jobs really well. Like, he's making over 150 meters with his running, which is really good because you're taking those tough carries from fullback. Not quite Roger Tuivasa-Sheck light Shans Nickel-Krokstad stats, but he's getting there, like 16 runs, 160 meters, that type of thing, which is pretty impressive for Hayze Perham as a fullback. And I'm just interested in how he performs against the Tigers, because you should be able to see the Bulldogs really flex some of their attacking systems. So it's like, what does Hayze Perham do with Matt Burton? What does Hayze Perham do with Viliami Kikau? How does Hayze Perham pop up on the right edge where it's more Kyle Flanagan? And of course, you do have a lot of other Kiwi-NRL talent in this Bulldogs team. Raymond Faitala Mariners starting at lock, Otahuhu Jr., Fa'amanu Brown out of Christchurch. I believe he's a Hornby Jr. off the top of my head. And for anyone wondering, I don't think Karl Olowapu is going to... I don't think he's going down the Kiwi-NRL route. because I do think he moved to Queensland at a young enough age where he might be Queensland eligible. Um, but I don't know. Like I've seen stuff on the Randwick Kingfishers Facebook page where they're big up in Karl Aluapu, so he might have a hearty, like he is a Randwick junior, but that connection might be real strong, which could be interesting. But I don't. Yeah, I don't know. But he is on the extended bench for the Bulldogs. He has been a starting half in New South Wales Cup for the Bulldogs. He is a Randwick junior. He is really good. He will play NRL this year, so keep an eye on him. But I think he is big enough that he could play like a really interesting utility role for the Bulldogs, which might come at the expense of Manu Brown, but hopefully he can hold on to that. But I think the Bulldogs are quite a funky group because, as we mentioned, Phil Gould, he's doing major Kiwi-NRL recruitment at all levels. Their Jersey flag team had Sione Moala in the halves. I think Eric Va'afosuanga was starting at centre. He's from Auckland as well. Isaac Matalavea Booth scored 2 tries for their Jersey flag team a couple weeks ago. He's a Manurewa junior, and he is absolutely massive. And let alone any of the other junior stuffs, SG Ball and so on. Point being, the Bulldogs are a emerging Kiwi-NRL organisation, and at the top level, the NRL level, you've got Hayze Perham starting at fullback in a really key role for that team. And of course, when you think bigger picture, the Bulldogs are building, the Bulldogs are signing all these players, Stephen Crichton's coming next season and so on. That's going to put Hayze Perham in an interesting spot as well, because if he plays the house down at fullback this season for the Bulldogs, some of those other decisions will get quite interesting, because he'll either play his way into a new starting fullback gig somewhere else, or he'll complicate matters for the other big signings, the Aussie signings. So let's try finish here with some football. Wellington Phoenix. The men are facing Adelaide on Friday night. The women are facing Perth Glory on Saturday. You seem quite excited about the women's team right now. They have had a draw and a win in their last 2 games. They're still bottom of the ladder, but they are facing a Perth team who are only a couple of spots ahead. And as you've mentioned, they also face the Newcastle Jets to finish this season, who are 1 spot ahead of the Wellington Phoenix women. How, like, ahead of this Perth game, what's like some key reasons for optimism here with the Wellington Phoenix women? What have you seen in recent weeks, the draw and the win, that is really intriguing you?
Well, the draw itself was almost a win as well. I think Brisbane only scored in the last 10 minutes. Let me just check that. Yeah, 80th minute, they equalised. Phoenix have been leading since the 26th. Although I will say that was a game that felt like the equaliser was always going to come, because they, A, weren't able to put chances away to score a second goal while they're ahead, and B, always looked like that ball over the top, pace and behind, was going to be a frisky one to deal with. And yeah, Shea Connor's got them in the end, but it's a point to their tally, and they backed that up with an incredible win against Sydney FC last week, which, I mean, in many ways, it kind of just like it displayed the progress they've been making throughout the season and moving on from last season as well, later stages then, in a really nice, clear way, where it's like the issues that they still have were there. Like they scored from a set piece again. They're not scoring very many from open play, but they are at least threatening from set pieces, and that goal was pretty handy, like clearly. But they also defensively have been making nice steady improvements, and there's been a few little shifts in and out of there, and like Mackenzie Barry switching to right back in the last couple of weeks, keeping Marissa Vandermeer centre back, where she's like, you just watch anytime the Wellington Phoenix gets set pieces, whether it's attacking set pieces or defensive set pieces, Marissa Vandermeer wins at least 50% of available headers. Like, she's the one they target, and she's also the one who seems to be just winning, clearing all those defensive ones. It's nuts. For someone who ostensibly is a fullback, and Barry has played a lot of fullback, particularly through the grades, but seems more of a centre back these days, although Football Fern's been using her as a fullback as well. So maybe that's an interesting aspect to keep an eye on, because I think she's pretty handy either way. And when your best aspect as a defender is your insanely accurate tackling ability, it's not the worst thing to be hanging out on the wing where you're going to come up against running wingers, and therefore maybe that skill comes in even more handy. You tend to see fullbacks in, say, like Premier League, Champions League type situations where you get the high caliber stat sort of analysis going on. You tend to see the fullbacks make the most tackles in teams, fullbacks and sometimes midfielders if it's a sort of particularly combative team. So like little tweaks like that along the way, I think are quite handy. And they've also reached a point where, like, I don't think they've fully unlocked any of their attacking players yet. Like, it feels like Mickey Robertson has more to give that they've not quite been able to get to. Millie Clegg is developing. Paige Satchel is someone who has a habit of flattering to deceive, but does make things happen when she's out there, particularly when she's got a nice, simple game plan. Emma Ralston is hardly, I think it's the first time she's played 3 games in a row or something like that. Like, she's just hasn't quite had a run yet. She's obviously more to come there. Betsy Hassett, you just feel will be even more impactful if players around her are a little bit more consistent. Alyssa Wynnham's only just coming back into the team, had a couple of nice cameos off the bench. Like, Ava Pritchard's, if she could just like get a few more of that end product stuff similar to Satchel, she'd be that much more effective. Like, it feels like across the board, they haven't quite figured out how to get the best out of all of their attackers, but doing just enough. And their midfield's operating at such a higher level. Their defense is getting really good, and I think they've got a bit more purpose in their build-ups now. They're not just going sideways across the back line and then running out of space. They're being a bit more progressive with that stuff. There's really clear ways in which you can see how the team is operating better than they were before. And a lot of it is probably also just confidence from getting a few results. But yeah, the way that sets them up, they've got a potentially winnable game against Perth at home on Saturday here. They've got Newcastle Jets away next up, and the Jets, it's an away game, but they just beat the top of the table, Sydney FC, away. So that shouldn't be too much of a thing. It's Newcastle as well, so it's not like they're going all the way to Perth or anything like that. It's one of the shorter away trips. Newcastle are a little bit in free fall at the moment. They're not doing fantastically. I've forgotten about this, but they're getting bailouts from the league, I think, to continue to exist. The men's team's doing all right, but often what you see is it's not the men's team that suffers first. It's the women's team and the youth teams that suffer when the money's short. So the women's team is looking awful at the moment. They're definitely beatable either way. Then I think they've got, who have they got in the game after that? Adelaide? Which Adelaide aren't fantastic. Where are they on the table? They're 8th on the table. So they're only 8 points ahead of the Phoenix as it is. Neither Newcastle nor Adelaide have a New Zealander in their team either. So I don't think the Phoenix, it's too late with 4 games to go. Their last game is against Melbourne Victory. So that's probably a loss, although it is at home. So you never know. But Victory are kind of competing for those top 4 spots. So they're going to need those points. But definitely the next 2 weeks, I think, will probably be definitive as to whether they can avoid the wooden spoon. And honestly, at this point, I expect them to do that. Like, I think they're more likely than not to be able to get up to that 10th spot, avoid finishing last. I think that would make it a success, particularly seeing the progress throughout the season. So yeah, it's contextual stuff because we're talking about the difference between finish 11th and finishing 10th. We're not talking about a team competing for finals or anything like that. But I would consider that pretty successful season. So yeah, I'm definitely got the spirits up about the Phoenix women because you can see the ways in which they're progressing, which is very important.
The Wellington Phoenix men are progressing towards finals footy, and they face the Adelaide team, who is second on the ladder. Wellington Phoenix are 5th. Are these top 6 matchups? Like, obviously, the Wellington Phoenix need to keep winning games to be in finals footy. Like, they're not, solidified in that upper echelon. How was there anything last week? Who'd they play last week? Was that
Sydney FC as well.
yeah? So they were six, so they're right there
Everyone
with
played
them.
Sydney last week.
Yeah,
Breakers were
like
playing Sydney. The Warriors were playing Sydney.
there's a lot of Sydney NRL teams, so it is quite
But
weird when
specifically the ones called
yeah,
Sydney,
yeah.
not the Newcastles or the
Um, so the Wellington Phoenix, this will be a great test for them. They performed pretty well in the test against Sydney last week. Now they face Adelaide, who are second. Was there anything you picked up from that game against Sydney that sets you up for this game against Adelaide, as far as how the Phoenix played?
Well, the main thing isn't so much how they played as the practical aspects of the fact that they beat a team who was at that stage, I think, only 1 point behind them on the ladder, puts a bit of space between them, kind of makes a little bit of a split between the top five and the rest of the league. And also means that when they play Adelaide at 9:45 kickoff away from home, if they win, they will. Oh, I was going to say if they win, they'll go tied on points. I'm looking at the table. Actually, if they win, you have to improve your goal difference by at least one if you win. And Adelaide's is only 1 goal better. So the Phoenix would actually go ahead of Adelaide on goal difference if they win. Adelaide is second on the table. There are then 3 teams tied on 31 points. Adelaide are on 34 points. Phoenix, of those 3 teams, Central Coast, Western Sydney being the other two, Phoenix have the worst goal difference. Those other 2 teams would also still stay ahead of the Phoenix on goal difference if they also win. But, there's 6 games left. There's still a little way to go. However, this is a sneaky crucial game for the Phoenix if they want to say that simply making the finals isn't enough. If they want to go on and compete for a championship, which I think they're definitely good enough to do, it's a bit like the Breakers, Sydney Kingston, where Melbourne City are the best team, but the Phoenix, there's no reason why they can't end up being the best of the rest. And then in a one-off grand final, who knows what can happen, especially because it won't be in Melbourne, it'll be in Sydney. And turns out that thing about moving the grand finals to Sydney might actually come into the Phoenix's favor if they end up against the rampant Melbourne City side there on neutral territory rather than away. It might actually be a good thing. But yeah, big game for the Phoenix in terms of their aspirations of finishing potentially even in the top 2. And if you finish in the top 2, you get a bye through the first week. If you finish third or fourth, you still have to play in the first round, but you get home semi-final, elimination final, rather than away, which they've had to do the last couple of times when they've failed to win. Last 3 times, I think, actually, because Rudan's season they also made the elimination final and lost. So it's definitely the next step. Like, it's the next big thing they need to achieve. They've done a lot of other things. They've had a record finish under Taine. They've played great football, great signings, players being sold to Europe, like so much success and stability in the team, which we haven't really seen before, but they haven't made that finals run. Haven't even scored a goal in the finals under Taine. So that's definitely the priority. And I don't know. They weren't fantastic against Sydney. They were actually under the pump for a lot of that game, but they showed that grittiness. They held in there. They managed to score early. They should have. You got to score a second goal if you want to be comfortable, because if you sit on a 1-0 lead, you can't blame anyone other than yourselves if you end up drawing or losing. But they got through there. They held on for a clean sheet. I think they've had 4 clean sheet victories in their last 10 games after none in their first 10. So they've stopped throwing away leads quite in the same way, or just can stop conceding sloppy goals quite in the same way that they were at the start of the season. They're getting, I think it was also like 11 points from their first 10 games and 20 points from their next 10 games. So there's definitely been that, I don't even want to call it improvement or progress. I think they were playing roughly as well as they were the whole way through. They've just started being a little bit more clinical in both penalty areas, pretty much. And mostly it's the defensive stuff, because they're still not scoring enough goals. They need to score more. They might be without Oscar Savada for this Adelaide game, which would be a risky one because his wife is due to give birth any moment. So I don't think he'll play that game, which is a tricky one without your top scorer, who's been the bulk of their goal-scoring output recently. But I don't know, maybe Costa Barbarousa steps up and fills that void somewhat. But yeah, I don't with the Phoenix the last few weeks, it's felt like it's not so much that they're playing any better than they have been. I actually think they're maybe playing a little bit worse. Like there's been a really grinding aspect to how they've performed, largely because they're not putting the goals away early on enough to be able to control games to be able to dictate things. But they're finding ways to win. And that's a really, really, really important thing. So if they can find a way to win in Adelaide, where it's going to be difficult, they might not have their top scorer, they're going to be away from home against the second top team on the ladder. But if they find a way to win, that opens up the door for the rest of their season. Like that just gives you a free pathway to be like, we're not just here to compete, we're here to like challenge for everything. We want that finals run. We want to bring a finals game to Wellington as well. Like that's doable if they can continue to show the kind of like, I don't know, to use a basketball term, that grit and grindiness. Bring out their inner Steven Adams, and then we'll see where we go. And also, I should mention, like, Clayton Lewis did travel with the team. I don't know if he'll play this game, but he's certainly going to be back sooner rather than later. That's a pretty important aspect as well. Another shot in the arm ahead of the finals run potentially, or the run in towards the finals. Get one of your best, most creative players back. Seems like a good thing. Scott Woodden's starting to get back into the swing of things after looking a bit rusty coming back from injury. Like there's some good yarns there. Jan Sass is playing his best football of the season so far. That's very important. They really need him to be big the rest of the way. So there's a lot to like about both Phoenix teams at the moment. I'm real optimistic. I'm not just calm about them. I'm excited about both of them. Excited in a calm way. I don't know. I don't want to spoil the theme of the podcast.
I just prefer the Kane Williamson method. Like I'm sure Kane Williamson gets excited, but he's always calm.
You got to have that grounded central whatever place. That you got to have your happy place, your calm place, I guess.
You got to get your bare feet out on the ground and really ground yourself to the earth. Big up yourself. Big up Aotearoa. Enjoy all the sporting action this weekend. Test starting tomorrow. Test summer's coming to an end. It was a beauty. It is a beauty. It's still a beauty. We're still in the middle of it. Let's enjoy it. Big up. Kia kaha. Stay beautiful. Chir chir.